Hello everyone and welcome. We have a bit of a different video today. This is the start of a video series which will be exploring gearing strategies for Dark and Darker. We'll get into individual strategies in much greater detail in future episodes, but before we have those conversations, I'd like to get on the same page about the fundamentals of gear and what makes it so impactful and how gear differential manifests as you limit test your way through the mid-game. To a very large extent, gearing is the end game of Dark and Darker. Gear is the most significant game system you will interact with. Gear is arguably the only meaningful means of progression in the game. After you become comfortable with your class, after you become comfortable with mob AI, after you become comfortable with the base game mechanics, gearing is what you will focus on to improve. This is not to say that an individual's skill, mechanics, tactics, and guile don't play a large part in what makes Dark and Darker a great game. There's room for skill expressions at all gear levels, and the choices you make in the heat of the moment, in the midst of combat, are all very meaningful. But with that said, the amount of skill, mechanics, and guile it takes to overcome a significant delta in gear level or a gear differential between you and your adversary cannot be overstated. It is very hard to beat an opponent who is wearing even one rarity tier better equipment than yourself on average, which is incidentally why I think the zero to hero format is so popular on YouTube. It's hard to achieve. It takes a great deal of player skill and a bit of luck to take a fresh character to a well-geared state, where you can essentially take any fight you'd like. It takes a great deal of skill, and it's one of the reasons why you don't see me doing those on this channel. Let's start off with a bit of a primer on gear in general, and then from there develop a framework for discussing how gear translates into power for your character. Each piece of gear is essentially a container for stat points. These stat points give your character more HP, more damage, access to more advanced spells, more spell damage, more movement speed, everything in between. Let's start off by examining this basic ranger. He has basic equipment. These are all vendor-purchased gray or white items. And we're going to start by examining these riveted gloves. For the purposes of this discussion, I am going to lump all white and gray items into the same bucket. They are nominally slightly better at the white level than the gray level, but they have so much more in common than they do any kind of significant differences between those. For example, a gray or white item, they cannot have enhancement rolls, which we'll come back to in a second. They can only have white line, which is granting 1 and rarely 2 stat point enhancements. But so first, let's take a look at these Ranger's gloves, riveted gloves, and talk about how much better an epic rarity set of these gloves are compared to the gray starter gloves. You'll see that these gray gloves have an armor rating of 11 and provide an additional point of strength. These stat points appear as white text and are referred to by the Dark and Darker community as white lines on the gear. Let's compare these gloves to, say, a pair of green rarity riveted gloves for a moment. You'll notice on these green gloves that both the amounts of armor and the amounts of strength being awarded have increased as compared to the gray pair. You'll also notice that we now have a blue line of text, which in this example here are conferring an additional 4 max HP. These blue lines are referred to as item enhancements by the Dark and Darker community. These enhancements are randomly generated or rolled when the item drops. Both the stat itself can vary as well as the range of that stat inside a given roll. To expand on this example, these gloves could have rolled with an altogether different stat in the place of the blue line, which is currently granting plus 4 max HP. Alternatively, it could have rolled with plus 1 physical damage. Or we could have the same stat, in this case max health, and it could have rolled plus X max health. But the value of that roll could have been plus 1 instead of plus 4, as we see here. Just as a quick aside, this video was recorded during early access build hotfix 20. There are fairly complex rules about what enhancements can roll on what items and in which slots. These are also relatively there are also relatively new rules about what enhancements can roll together, adjoined to the same piece of gear, what certain other enhancements can roll with it. We are setting aside the complexity of all of that for today's conversation, as it's likely to change and continue to be tinkered with by Iron Mason future updates. This is a big caveat, as this is an early access game that is very much in its early stages of early access. If you're enjoying this content in the future, please be sure to check that you're watching the most current guide on this channel, as I will likely publish an altogether new guide when any tectonic changes to the gearing system take place. Now, let's compare these gray gloves to these green gloves to these epic quality riveted gloves. You'll see here that the strength on the white line has scaled proportionate to the rarity. Instead of conferring 1 strength, these epic gloves are conferring 3. Additionally, instead of having 1 blue line, in the last example it was +4 max health, there are now 3 blue lines conferring 3 altogether different stats. Those stats themselves can roll in a range, which varies by the enhancement type. So you can tell that if you had your choice between any of these 3 gloves, you would probably take the purple ones anytime. But for a second, let's step back and talk about weapons, as weapons roll differently as well. At the time of this recording, there are no weapons or weapon slot items that follow exactly the same rules. Weapon slot items never have white line attributes. Instead, all of their scaling goes into the damage output of the specific weapon. In this case, we're examining longbows of 3 different rarities. You'll see that they do scale, in fact, by the white line, damage at the top, increasing between white and green from 36 to 39, and then the blue longbow has a corresponding 40 top end damage. You'll also notice that the item enhancements, the blue lines on the item, went from 1 on a green item to 2 blue lines on a blue item. These scaling principles are at play not only on the longbow but all other weapons. They do follow the same scaling principles. We see that between the white, green, and blue versions of the bow, the base damage of the weapon white line is increasing. Starting at green rarity, weapon slot items gain a single enhancement or a blue line and gain 1 with each rarity level ascending. Some of the best, most coveted enhancements can only roll on weapons or rarely roll anywhere else but weapons, and so the weapon slot is always going to be highly coveted. Also, circling back for a moment, you'll notice that we have 2 different weapon sets in play. The first one here, which is occupied by the starting recurve bow. The second one here, which is occupied by a short sword. Technically, these could be dual wielded, so for the purposes of future discussions, weapon set 1A, weapon set 1B, weapon set 2A, and 2B. It's important to realize that any stats that are conferred by an item in your weapon slots are only applied to your character when that weapon is equipped. So if I have my recurve bow out, I will only gain bonuses from that item when it is out, and my short sword's bonuses would be ignored during that time period. Also, as another fringe example, bards in particular have a lot of utility items in their utility slots, their various instruments. Those can roll with enhancement lines as well, but those are only manifest when that equipment is brought to bear. So if they have their flute out, for example, and their flute is conferring stats, then those are only applied to the character when that is equipped in the place of a weapon slot item, etc. During your time in the dungeon, you will hear people say that I found this item, but it's poorly rolled, or it has bad rolls, or it has dead stats. Poorly rolled can mean several things, but generally it's either a reference to the enhancement being one that their class does not desire, and therefore it is a dead stat. Like, for example, magic damage for most ranger builds would be considered a dead stat, or it's rolled a stat that you like, but it's on the low end of its potential enhancement range. It could have rolled, say, from 0.1% to 0.5%, and it rolled 0.2%. It's a role that I like, it's an enhancement that I like, but it's just not of a magnitude where I'm excited about it. Now, meta builds for each class are ever evolving. I mean, add to that, one of the stated goals for Iron Mace is to increase like the diversity of their character builds in future content releases. We're not going to spend any time debating what stats are good for or what builds or enhancements are good choices on which characters. Each of those is probably a video discussion of its own. Instead, we will concede that all stat increases are helpful and that we are going to take a big picture perspective on gear, the stats that those gear items contain, and what each item rarity increases are actually bringing to your character in terms of power and progression. So far, we've illustrated that stats scaling on individual pieces of gear. We've established that gear pieces are essentially containers for holding those stats, and that those stats scale upward as the rarity of your items increase. Now let's revisit here this stock ranger in his stock gear and contemplate what kind of power budget he has based on the attributes that are available to him. Right now he has a forest hood that's conferring 1 strength. He has riveted gloves, which are conferring 1 strength. He has a warden's outfit, which is conferring 1 point of agility. He has loose trousers, which are conferring 1 point of agility. He has lightfoot boots, which do not have any meaningful stats, but they do confer movement speed. Other classes have options for better boots. Some examples include the wizard shoe, the occultist boots. I'm not seeing any right there. But regardless, it depends on your class. This is as tricked out as I can get a ranger in white and grays from a stat budget perspective. And with this stat budget, I have 5 potential attribute points that can be conferred on this character in gray and white gear. Let's compare and contrast that for a second and assume that I have all green gear rarity or higher. Looking at this forest hood with 1 strength, I can now look at this forest hood that is green. Notice that the strength has scaled up and the enhancement line is now there, providing me 4 additional armor. Let's instead also assume that I have all green items equipped in every slot. Now, warning, there is going to be math ahead. You've been warned. Try to white knuckle your way through it. It's not going to get too deep. But assuming that we have green pieces of gear in all of these slots, which the green equipped ranger can have neck, rings, boots, legs, chest, gloves, head, weapon, and not a cloak. The lowest rarity level on a cloak is blue, and therefore if you were to say a ranger in greens, literally he could not have a cloak because cloak's lowest rarity level is blue. Which is also why we don't have any rings or amulets equipped. They cannot be white or gray. At the time of this recording, the lowest level for a ring or amulet is green. But let's assume we had all of those pieces in play. Looking at the table that is generated here on the right, by simply tabulating the potential stat and item enhancement levels from all of the gear slots available to the ranger at the green equipment level, you'll see that I've gone from a stat budget pool of 5 points in gray and white to a stat budget pool of 20 points, including stats and enhancements across the board. Here's how this breaks down by slot. And understanding the differential between a ranger in grays and a ranger in greens should be pretty obvious to you right now. Purely creating a framework whereby we weigh the power level of a character based on the availability of stats and blue line enhancements on gear. The green equipped ranger is 4 times more powerful than one in gray. To continue to extrapolate this onward, so in the blue equipment leveled ranger does have access to a cloak, and we now see that our potential power pool budget is at 35 as compared to a green ranger who has 20, a significant leap. but not nearly as severe as the jump from gray to green. Blue is kind of the halfway point here in the overall gear equation. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. But as we continue to evaluate, this very simple framework for evaluating power as it relates to gear, a fully equipped Purple Ranger has at their disposal 48 points worth of potential power in their budget, based on the number of enhancements that can roll on gear slots, setting aside the upper end scaling of stats on the white line. This is something I've found very difficult to kind of juxtapose with the scaling of enhancements, is the fact that the very high-end items scale up to 3 and 4 points with regard to pure attributes. So, as we kind of progress this discussion, the reality is that someone in full legendaries and uniques is actually significantly stronger than these tables indicate. But I really don't have an easy way of keeping the conversation both simple, easy to digest, and probably that granular. So let's just talk about the purple budget, right? So if you're in full epics, you essentially have access to 48 points of potential power in your power budget, as compared to the guy in grays with 5. So let's reflect on this for a second and then do a percentage comparison to the power levels, between purple equipped players and gray equipped players. Once again, going back to our gray ranger here, the gray equipped ranger has essentially 5 points of power in his pool. This once again being designated by the number of attributes and the number of enhancements his gear slot can potentially have. The purple player has 48. And so this is the largest practical differential you're likely to encounter. If you're going into normal games, and I'm sure you have, with starter gear or, gray white level gear, that guy who you're fighting with in all purples that it seems impossible to beat and extremely unfair, it is exactly that. Like, he is so vastly more powerful than you that you would have to hit him a dozen times and he would have to hit you twice. That's a kind of a little bit of a simplification, but with regard to every meaningful metric, just compared to a player in full purples and the amount of power they're able to leverage in their stats, it's 2.5 times greater than a player in all greens. This is probably the most stark example of what gear does in a practical sense, because this scenario happens all day, every day, right? You've got full teams running with some combination of blue, purple, and legendary. In normals, they're gunning down people who are equipped in grays and whites. And frankly, this is why you lose to them. I'm not saying that these guys aren't skilled. I'm not saying you're not skilled. I'm not saying that rarely you won't be able to take these guys down. I'm just saying that all other things being equal, both luck and player skill, the amount of power that is budgeted to a player wearing purples, is 2.5 times that as a green player, and setting aside the giant jump from gray to green, right? So I think these numbers are pretty illustrative with regard to not only the realities that you may be facing, but also what your strategy should be. Using this framework, we're going to expand on this and talk about what your gearing strategy should be. And a little bit of a spoiler here, everything but blues can essentially be disregarded because they're mathematically insignificant. Now, nobody runs like a perfectly rolled single color set, right? You may have an outstandingly well-rolled blue that's intermixed with your otherwise epic set. You may have a really poorly rolled legendary that you decide to put in your mostly blue set. Like, all of these things are possible, but on the average, you should be able to calculate, where your power pool is, and understand that, in terms of evaluating where your gear is versus an adversary's, and you can kind of render an expected outcome. Because circling back to what we said at the start of this conversation, overcoming, gear differential is extremely hard. You often lose fights in Dark and Darker, and you don't really understand what happens. Sometimes there's poor decisions. Sometimes, you get outplayed. Sometimes you're caught off guard. A lot of the time, it really boils down to this chart. Who has access to potential power and how that's being leveraged in the moment. It is the difference between you requiring X number of hits to bring down an adversary versus them being able to sustain Y before they succumb to your attacks. And this kind of illustrates that. So taking a second here to look at the deltas here between gray, white, and purple. Once again, this is the most realistic expectation. If you're going into a normal game and you have low gear levels, the thing you've got to look out for are well-equipped groups running epics, and they smoke you. You already know this. This is a daily reality for you. The message here is that blue is really the minimum gearing level if you want to compete in regulars. And blues are hard to get in regulars. Blues drop like greens do in normals in high roller. So as I've advised to you previously, like if you're trying to gear up your character, if you're trying to generate wealth to be able to assemble sets of gear, you really need to be in high roller, because like the blue to purple delta is extremely small, right? Like it's 35 points of potential power on the blue level as compared to 48 on the purple. It's a 137% shift. Even going up to legendaries, you're still under 100% delta with those stat changes. And this is like hand waving away the complexities of what stat and enhancement is good for your class and how optimized is your gear set versus an opponent's. Just assuming that all those things are equal, right? That you have built yourself in the most efficient meta format and you are fighting somebody who has done the same. This is the right framework to be making gearing decisions. And the first decision is, how am I going to gear myself in blues so I can stop wearing greens, whites, and grays? Because they are of almost no value. I would not recommend ever spending money on them at this point, simply because of the amount of power that's available to leverage through blue and purple items. So we're going to spend some more time talking about this. This framework is essentially the starting point for discussing gear strategy. And so stay tuned for my next video where we're going to start going into details about how you take yourself from Timmy levels of equipment and start assembling sets of well-appointed blue or higher gear so you can be competitive and play the game in the ways that you'd like to play it, instead of essentially having to play it in order to be able to survive this massive differential. Anyway, if you've enjoyed this content, please like and subscribe. It helps me a ton, but regardless, good luck to you in your raids to come.